Welcome everybody to the Wilderness Issues Lecture Series, this year focused on conservation in a time of climate change. The series is sponsored by the Wilderness Institute and the Climate Change Studies Program and supported through a grant from the Cinnabar Foundation. My name is Nikki Fear and I coordinate the Climate Change Studies Program and I'm one of the co-sponsors. If any of you would like to know more about the Climate Change Program, interested in minoring in climate change studies, there's information on that table there with a handout about the upcoming summer and fall courses, as well as information about Wilderness Institute programs on that side. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Courtney Flint, who joins us from Illinois to talk about bark beetles and specifically about community responses to forest disturbance from insects. In honor of her speaking tonight, and she doesn't know this, we are launching a new blog site. Students from Steve Running's lab and Corey Cleveland's lab have taken on an independent project to write about climate impacts to the resources in Montana, to our land, and also to our people. And in honor of Courtney's talk, the first blog entry is about bark beetles and some of the outbreaks we've been seeing here. And the blog site is intended to make the science readable for the layperson. So that site is montanaclimatechange.wordpress.com. And the authors are interested in having a dialogue with the community in case you have questions for them. So Courtney is going to speak for about 50 minutes till around 8, and then we'll have time for Q&A. We'd love for you all to stay till 8:30. If you need to leave early, please do so quietly because we are filming, MCAT is filming this for public television. All of the lecture series are actually going to be available on the Climate Change Studies Program website within the next few weeks for any of those that you've missed that you want to see from the past. We hope you return next week. Ray Rasker is going to be here from Headwaters Economics, and he's going to be talking about the growing cost of wildfire. The Forest Service now spends about $3 billion a year on fighting wildfires, which has doubled in the last 10 years. So he's going to be talking about the combined effects of growing number of homes being built in the wildland-urban interface, the growing effects of climate change, and some policy recommendations for how we might be able to drive down some of those costs. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Courtney Flint. She comes here from the University of Illinois. She's a rural and natural resource sociologist and an assistant professor in the Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences department there. She is no stranger to Montana. She was born at St. Pat's Hospital here in Missoula. Her parents live here. In fact, they're here tonight. Raise your hands. And her brother. Thank you. So she spent a lot of her childhood here in Montana. She got her MS in geography from the University of Colorado. She got her PhD in rural sociology from Penn State University. She focused her research up in the Kenai Peninsula, where she interviewed and met with community members to understand their perspectives and responses to bark beetle kill in the forest there. She got hired by the Forest Service to do a similar kind of study down in Colorado. A lot of her focus of her talk tonight, we're going to be sharing what she learned from those experiences. She heads up a lab at the University of Illinois called the Community and Natural Resources Lab, and her research program looks at how rural people and communities respond to environmental disturbance and change. She's done a lot of interesting projects throughout North America. At dinner, she was telling us about work she did up in Alaska to understand the local knowledge and health properties of wild berry resources in tribal communities. And this was a participatory action project where she had children in the schools actually go out and do the research. And so she had them ask the questions of the elders about their knowledge of the berries, as well as had the students get involved in learning about the biochemistry of those berries. She's done interesting work and is doing work in Illinois now on a big project with biogeochemists and agricultural engineers to look at how to reduce agricultural nitrate runoff. And she's working in Austria and France to pioneer work on cultural ecosystem services in collaboration with landowners and other collaborators there. And she says the best part of her work is learning from people and places to help bring rural voices and perspectives into natural resource decision making. So, sorry, I'm just have a little bit left. So we invited her here because we obviously have a growing bark beetle outbreak challenge. Gloria Flora last week talked about the large swath of forest disturbed by insect kill between Butte and Helena. And so she can share with us tonight her experiences, as I said, in Alaska and in Colorado, with a focus on community risk perception, attitudes towards forest management, and local action. So she's a bundle of energy. We just have to keep feeding her quarters, she says, to keep talking till 8. And we're really happy to have her here. So thank you, Courtney.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the warm introduction. I really appreciate it, Nikki. And thanks to Laura Young, who's not here this evening, but for all of her efforts in bringing me in here tonight. It's been a great couple of days. We're speaking with colleagues and students, and just being in Missoula. It is good to be home and spending time with colleagues and family, and it's great. So thanks so much for having me here. So what I hope to spend time talking with you tonight about is this whole issue of bark beetles. So titled my presentation Bark Beetle Blues. This whole thing has a bit of a pall of sort of sadness and grief and the loss of forests. But I hope as the evening goes along that you'll see some signs of positive things and some actual forward-looking that's actually got good momentum and a very positive note to it, along with some of the downsides of these kinds of forest disturbances. So we'll be talking about, I'll be sharing with you some of my observations of community experiences dealing with forest disturbances by bark beetles across over the last 10 years or so. All right, so just a bit of a roadmap to where we're going to go this evening together. We'll talk just briefly about bark beetles, and what I see my role in is bringing people into this picture, bringing people into our understanding of how forests are disturbed by these insects and how we can grapple with these changes. We'll talk a little bit about what the experiences have been like in north central Colorado and in Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula. I'll talk to you a little bit, give you a little bit of background about how I do my work, how I approach this research, and then spend the bulk of our time just highlighting the major findings and highlighting some of the specific community experiences that I've observed. And at the end, we'll sort of try to tie this all together with my observations on what I think works and what doesn't work in trying to grapple with these kinds of changes. So, if you take a broad scale look at North America and at the exposure to insect infestations in our forests, you can really see from the far southwestern parts of this country all the way up and through Canada and all the way out into central Alaska and down into the Kenai Peninsula. Various different species of bark beetles have been really munching their way through our trees back since, this latest round has really been going since about the mid-1990s. And of course, different forests and really working their way across the landscape. This swath of bark beetles is really unprecedented. Turns out these bark beetles are actually a very natural part of our forest. They're endemic in our pine forests and in our spruce forests. And so, those of you that have been in Montana for a few decades might remember, seeing some spots of patches of red trees, over time. They've kind of always been part of the forest. However, this latest big wave of outbreaks is unprecedented, and so we're seeing much larger blocks of forests that are being affected at the same time. Well, there's a lot of science behind this, and there's a lot of work that's been going into looking at the relationships between the insects and the trees, and that dynamic that climate parameters play in this whole cycle of activity in the forests, and that relationship between precipitation and temperatures, and what kind of climatic environment really makes these beetles really happy and just provides and then the trees provide this nice smorgasbord, and it's a bit of a perfect storm that comes along under certain conditions. And I'm not going to really talk about that dynamic at all tonight, because what I'm interested in is where people fit into this. All right, so how do people perceive these this changes in the forests, and what does it do to their connections with the forests around them, and do they have the same sort of connection with climate or climate change that the scientists have already been working out for us. And so this becomes something that I, going in, don't necessarily take for granted. I want to hear from local folks. How do they interpret this situation as they deal with these things in their everyday life? So I'm taking a little bit of a detour around this entomological and forestry kind of and climatological exploration of bark beetle activity into the human realm. All right, well, how did all this get started for me? Well, as spending quite a bit of time in Montana over the years, you'll all remember the fires of 2000. In Montana, certainly an experience that many of us don't particularly, we've had to experience again over time, but that year was a particularly rough one for Montanans. And sitting over coffee on May 30th or 31st of 2001 with my grandfather, the late John Stewart, who was a faculty member here on this campus and a dean on this campus for some time, we happened to open up the Missoulian together and noticed an article that talked about Grant Creek residents working together to clear up the brush and to mitigate, create defensible space, and to clear up the forests and take some local collective actions about take some fire-wise actions, mobilize sort of their local efforts, connect with perhaps some funding coming in available from on high, or the state or the federal, the Forest Service when it's available. And we got to chatting, and I said, well, tell me more about Grant Creek. I can't quite picture this. Tell me about why is it that this community is pulling together and is doing all of this work to work in their forests and to mitigate their forest risks, but others aren't. And so we had a great conversation about the history of Montana and the development of communities, and it really led me to I knew I was headed into the PhD program at Penn State in rural sociology, and I knew I wanted to really focus on an issue of the West and an issue that was at the community level of analysis and experience and dealing with risks and hazards that folks face. And it was this conversation that really led me into my dissertation topic. And then what's become 10 years of research funded by the U.S. Forest Service, working in Alaska and Colorado. So a lot of my work really focuses on this question that we were exploring over coffee that day, on why do different communities respond in such different ways to forest risks and disturbances. And that's where we're going to go today. Though my research has not been in Montana, I certainly coming to visit at least once a year over the last, well, for all of my life. This image down here that was the picture that was in the New York Times about this home nestled in near Helena in the woods, and the topic there, a house in the woods after the woods are gone. Certainly in Montana we've seen this experience with bark beetles, and again, not as a researcher, but I've been sort of part of seeing this as I've visited over time. And in 2004, this map up here in the corner showed this was the risk of forest mortality from insects. And when we certainly have seen this played out, you could see it to the whole country looking out from the vantage point of 2004. Boy, Western Montana was really in the crosshairs of this. And unfortunately, we've certainly seen this come to fruition in a number of places. But my research took me to Alaska first, and so I zoomed into the Kenai Peninsula, funded by both state and private forestry in Alaska, and the Pacific Northwest Research Station out of Portland. The spruce bark beetle in Alaska munched its way across over 1 million acres of trees on the Kenai Peninsula, over 90% mortality in these forests. And why was that? Well, this was a very old stand of trees, a very even-aged stand of trees. The summers had become drier and hotter. The winters had warmed up considerably. And those beetles were in heaven. And they munched their way across. As you can see here, the red here is all the dead white spruce. It's actually a hybrid spruce, a Lutz spruce in this area. And boy, the images that you can sort of see here on the left, this wasn't a tree here, a tree there. This was all of the trees, and amazingly over about 2 or 3 inches in diameter, which the foresters initially said couldn't and wouldn't happen, and that as they munched through the big trees, they worked their way into the smaller and smaller trees. And it was really an experience, as I'll share with you some of the observations. I started out working with 6 communities. So these communities were selected because they represented the different types of communities on the Kenai Peninsula. So those are the communities in yellow. So we started this work. My first trip up there was in 2002 to get started after doing some background research ahead of that. So we went in and this was my dissertation research. Went in, I spent 3.5 months, did interviews in these communities, and I'll show you about the methods in a minute. And so I did this study for my dissertation research. And then in the following years, there were a number of fires that broke out in the beetle kill on the Kenai Peninsula. Went back in just to Homer and followed up just to see how they were, if their attitudes and perspectives were changing at all. Then we had further fires in 2007, and we went back in and restudied all these communities with a very similar methodology. So we've been kind of monitoring this situation over time to see how community responses change. So we'll share with you some of those observations. In Colorado, this map shows the beetle kill. I think this is a cumulative beetle kill to date, yes, from 1996 to 2009, not quite to date. But by the time when I was studying in Colorado, when I was out there actually doing the work, this was started in 2005 and ran through about 2008. We're actually still analyzing data and writing manuscripts from this. And now you can see those beetles have been munching down the Front Range, but they weren't very active there in those years when I was getting going. But the black circle represents sort of the study region and the 9 communities that I worked with on the left here. And to date, we've got over 3.6 million acres affected, and these are by mountain pine beetles in predominantly lodgepole pine forests in Colorado. So what we're talking about here is comparative community analysis, where I've worked in 6 communities in Alaska, and they're listed here, all quite small. The largest community is Homer. The greater Homer area is sort of in the range of 8,000 to 9,000 people, all the way down to the smallest community of Moose Pass, which is no more than about 100 people there, and then ranging across and in between. Some communities on the coast, 2 tribal communities with very active tribal associations, native associations, making up about 30% of the community's population. That's Soldovia and Ninilchik, Cooper Landing and Moose Pass in the mountains, and Anchor Point and Homer down on the coast. In Colorado, I worked with 9 communities there, ranging from the ski resort towns of Vail and Breckenridge to Steamboat Springs, which had a ski resort, but also a bigger community. That community was the largest I'm going to forget this, somewhere in the range of about 10 to 12,000 folks. To the smallest community in the study area, which is Walden, much more of a ranching community up in the far northern part of the state, and a couple of other communities in between, Granby and Kremling, also in Grand County, Dillon and Silverthorne, and Frisco, somewhat near Breckenridge, and then Vail, of course. All right, so 15 communities in total, and it's really been an interesting ride to get to know the folks in these communities and get to learn from them about how different communities experience these kinds of changes. Well, how do I do my work? Well, I take a very mixed methods approach. I just am not comfortable with one methodology to answer questions. I think questions as complicated as these that are looking at real people in real places, we know that certain methods have a tendency to yield certain types of responses and results. Certain people are somewhat more reluctant to participate on one type of research approach, but they may be more comfortable in another. I like to do this, to get at multiple sides of questions and to come at these problems from different directions. So in the 2 studies combined, I conducted over 300 interviews with folks everywhere from local business owners to community leaders to school teachers and librarians to county commissioners and some forestry personnel and all kinds of other categories of people. Also following up with receiving over 3,000 surveys, which means we've sent surveys to nearly 6,000 people, actually a little over 6,000 people, and these are just the residents randomly sampled from the 15 communities. We also find census data, secondary data about the communities to be important in understanding the demographic changes. We've also looked at tree mortality data and some fire data, and have incorporated a little bit of GIS analysis so that we can actually map out what's going on in these communities. And then trying to keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening in these communities by monitoring some of the media analysis of newspapers. Today, I will predominantly be speaking to you about the results over across the hall of this, but pulling in a little bit from the interviews and a little bit of the surveys, excuse me, as we go through. At least 15 students, graduates and undergraduates, has participated in different phases of this work, and so a great thanks to them, and this would not be possible without their help, particularly everything after my dissertation research is heavily dependent upon student work, so many thanks to them. I don't think I'm going to get a drink of water. Okay, so as we work our way through what we found over these years, I'm going to highlight these particular areas. It's a bit tough, interesting, summarizing 10 years of research in 40 to 45 minutes. So we'll pick some of the highlights and talk about those for a while. We'll talk about how communities have varied in their responses and experiences. Talk about the diversity of perceived impacts and risks from bark beetles. Talk a little bit about changes over time that we've found. Grapple with these issues of faith in forest management and in forest industry. Some of my observations about local knowledge versus science versus management and the different ways of making sense of environmental change. We'll ask this question about climate change, get back to that. Do folks generally perceive this as something related to climate change or not? And then finish up with this what works, what doesn't question. All right, well, you know, community variation is really what came out. If I had to say number one finding, it's that no two places are really alike in how they deal with these kinds of changes. And it was actually community members that made this very clear to me. You know, here's a quote from Walden in Colorado where they really highlighted that the issues are definitely different in each community. And so Steamboat Springs is different from other communities. And they said each community is going to need to handle this in their own particular way because each one has different values and objectives. And if there's anything that I have found, it is truly that. And the local culture of a place makes a really big difference. You know, in Homer, Alaska, someone said, if you take any issue and you roll it down the street, people will scurry to jump to take sides, right? And that's the culture of that place. They love to debate and battle over the issues. Versus another community, say Cooper Landing up in the mountains in Alaska, where they really share a fairly common identity. Their culture, their community is based on the values of everybody working together, and they're quite homogenous, and they really quite get along, strong sense of community identity, and everything in between. Every community had a bit of a different local culture to it that came out really loud and clear. So that was an important thing. The other key thing is that in terms of the impacts, what did this experience, what was it meaning for the people in their daily lives and experiences? And I think the top impact had to be that this thing was an emotional experience. These folks went through a huge grieving process that had strong attachments to their forests. And so the death of those trees felt like the death of family members. It was really tragic for these folks. So we have quotes from folks saying, it's sad, it's devastating. We bought 15 acres and the next spring we had to take out 1,500 dead trees. We have a view now, but no forest. You know, this idea, people would recognize and they'd acknowledge a bit begrudgingly that, yeah, I guess these beetles are kind of natural, but we don't really like change, and it's hard to adjust to these kinds of changes, and they're coming at us really quickly. In Homer, I have to read this quote because it's really a rich one. So someone in Homer said, I think that people were in love with spruce trees. When I first lived here, I lived in 20 acres of spruce trees, and I lived like a hobbit. I couldn't see my neighbors. I couldn't even find a way in until I had a road built. I'd get lost walking through the trail, through the hobbit forest with mushrooms and thick moss and dripping, towering, majestic spruce. I was in love with them. And then they all got sick and died, so people grieved in that process majorly, and they cried over it. It was so sad to see all of their trees die around their homes. Have anybody been to Homer, Alaska? Right, you can just picture this, right? I mean, this is a real Homer kind of thing. They have really strong connections with their trees and with their environment. So this was a grieving process for them. Not for everybody, but for many people. This was pretty shocking. All right, so think of, I was led to believe by the Forest Service when I started doing this work that this bark beetle problem was a fire problem. This was a serious risk for these communities, and my job was to figure out why on earth they weren't addressing this as a fire issue. Well, what I learned very quickly was that yes, this was a fire issue, but it was also a big issue in a number of different areas. And so this graph shows all of the different impacts that were expressed to me as things that were happening as a result of the mortality in the trees from bark beetles. And the other thing is that some of these impacts were, of course, very negative. Falling trees, falling on cars and power lines and so forth. And the aesthetic loss, certainly. Loss of privacy, there was that picture back a little bit. Here, this one. Imagine this as you move into the forest to get away from everybody, right? And you're hiding away, your neighbors can't see you and you can't see them, but all the trees die and you kind of end up, they fall down or you clear them out and all of a sudden you live in a fishbowl, and that's not what you moved to Alaska for 5 decades ago. And so that really challenges this sense of place. So privacy loss, and the fire hazards in there too, and erosion and runoff, these emotions of grief and sadness and worry and anxiety, conflicts, changes in habitats, harvesting costs a lot of money to deal with these trees, tourism, but then we start to get into some things that were kind of neutral. And as you look at the survey data, some things actually had, some folks saying some of these things had positive spin-offs. The logging that happened, the timber industry, well, that was pretty good for some folks. It created a few jobs in Alaska. As those trees came out, we had some pretty great views. The realtors started to coin this phrase, emergent view, and they were selling property, but cleared out the dead trees, and we can sell this for a fortune, right? Well, many people started to realize, well, this was a process that was going to rejuvenate the forest, and maybe these were some old trees, and well, we'll get a new forest out of this. And we've really learned a lot about forest change, and never knew anything about bark beetles before, and it's great for firewood. So, what I learned, I was sent in there expecting this to be a fire issue, and what I learned was that this had a lot of deep connections for folks in a lot of different directions. Some of those impacts were really seen as positives. In Colorado, a similar story. I'm presenting here just a few of the impacts to show you just, fire is certainly close to the top at nearly 94% saying that this has been an impact, this fire hazard, and a pretty negative one. But some other things like logging and land clearing and increased ecological awareness, certainly an impact, but a positive one, coming out above that neutral number of 3 on a scale of 1 to 5. And of course, you're getting a difference of opinion across people, and these are just the overall averages here. But again, a real broad array of experiences. But the fire risk was certainly part of things, so you have someone saying beetle kill has absolutely spurred this disaster planning process where a tinderbox, it's taken the priority from bioterrorism, which had happened after 9/11, right off the chart, and now fire's been elevated. And so we had folks, community planners and the like, really changing their disaster planning efforts. But it was more than fire. We had people concerned about water quality and erosion as the trees were coming out and losing that absorptive capacity that they had for the water and runoff. And concerns about, tourists and visitors and recreationalists and whether who wants to come to a dead forest to play? And what was that going to mean to the economy of these amenity-oriented towns? But the fire certainly kept coming up. It was a very dominant theme, especially in Colorado. And over half of the survey respondents indicated that their concern about wildfire strongly increased, so a 5 out of 5 on a 5-point scale, as a result of the bark beetle. And that's overall all of those 9 communities. And you can see that they vary to a certain extent. Some communities, a little bit more people seriously thinking it's increased their concern about fire, and a little bit less in some places. But one of the interesting things is these 3 communities on the top, with the most people saying that their concern about fire had increased with the bark beetles, are actually sitting in open valleys with hardly any trees around those communities. Right? They're in these open, flat areas, and the trees are, in some cases, well, for Walden, about 15, 20 miles away. And yet, what I discovered was their sense of community and their attachment to their place included a much broader area than what we might think of as just being in our little town. And so that was an interesting thing, and those folks were even more concerned about the fire risk and many of the other impacts from bark beetles. But as we looked at the array of risks, what people were concerned about looking forward across this beetle outbreak as it was unfolding, there were differences across communities. So everything that has the little stars here shows you where there were statistically significant differences amongst the 9 communities. It was only invasive species where it was common for about 63% of community residents to agree that invasive species was going to be was potentially a problem stemming from the bark beetle. But so you end up with numbers down here like 24% overall. Is the average, saying that this was a particular risk on a 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale about risk concerns. But in a community like Walden, with its traditions of livestock grazing and ranching, that number was up in about 75%. So really started to see the variations in the perspectives, and it depends on what the orientation of the community. Obviously, Vail and Breckenridge aren't that concerned about the impact on livestock grazing, right? But they're very concerned about that scenic integrity and for their tourist economy and property values and fire risks and everything else. All right. Well, how do these things change over time? Going back onto the Kenai Peninsula, it was very interesting. And with the help of a couple of graduate students from Penn State who went up and did some interviews and set the stage for another study, a survey study of these communities. What we learned was that in those 4 years, right, risk perceptions in general had decreased somewhat. They were not as concerned in general about those things that they thought were going to go bad from this bark beetle experience. But fire risk had stayed high or even gotten a little bit higher. But the non-fire risks, all those other concerns, loss of community identity and water erosion and habitat loss, those things had settled down a little bit. They weren't quite as high. And so just zooming in a little bit, these 2 communities of Cooper Landing and Moose Pass, both fairly small communities, both situated in a national forest, both in the mountains, both beautiful settings on lakes nearby, just seemingly from the outsider's perspective to be very similar communities. But if you look at what's going on in here, let's zoom into where these ovals are. Cooper Landing's on the left, Moose Pass here on the far right. And in many of the different risk concerns, they were completely different trajectories. Loss of community identity tied to the forest. Cooper Landing hadn't ever really been that concerned about it and was even less concerned, but Moose Pass was on the rise. Grass fire concern. Well, neither community had a whole lot of the natural grasses coming in the wake of the tree loss, but Moose Pass was increasing right whilst Cooper Landing was decreasing in their concern. And loss of scenic aesthetic quality, that's the little yellow line here, up at the top, the white line, I think. And in Moose Pass is nearly off the charts about concerns about scenic and aesthetic quality, whereas Cooper Landing is not. Very similar forest structure, but a different local culture to them, which gave them a different orientation. So we really started to see different things happening. Well, remember, these communities all experienced some nearby fires in between those times. And so our question was, had this fire experience changed their opinions on what was going on? And one of the things we found was that satisfaction with resource management between 2004 and 2008 for all of the entities except for the native associations had gotten better. So they were really upset about bark beetles in '04. They had a couple of pretty big fires in the following years, but by 2008, they were feeling pretty good about resource managers. Right? Why is that? Well, you know what? These fires, they felt, were really handled very, very well. They were coordinated well. They were kept out of communities. There were fire breaks built. They had lots of local support. They allowed the local firefighters to help and work with the Forest Service folks. And it really went well. And so their level of trust and confidence in many of these different agencies was on the upswing. And so that's a pretty short time to see a kind of turnaround like this. In Colorado, along these same lines of faith in forest management, back when we first started doing the work, boy, they weren't too happy with especially the Forest Service as land managers here, especially in the towns that had roots in logging. They felt like their livelihoods had been shut down by the actions of the Forest Service, and as it led into the bark beetle situation, they felt that their situation had been ignored, and to the point where the bark beetles were an epidemic and uncontrollable. They were very concerned that their efforts were for naught, especially for those folks that were adjacent to Forest Service lands. They felt like they could do all their efforts were just a drop in the bucket because the problem was out actually on the biggest problem was out on the Forest Service land. And really, you know, if anybody was wearing a black hat, that was the Forest Service, and the strong feeling that they're not doing anything and they're just letting it all die. So there was a really negative perspective, particularly in these communities that had this stronger identity with timber harvesting and with logging. For some communities, as I mentioned earlier, the mortality, the death of the trees from bark beetles was actually had a bit of a bright light associated with it. And a community like Anchor Point, which is really involved in extractive resources across the board, and folks that have a strong value for maximizing the utility of the natural resources around them. As this person said, it actually provided a little economic boost. We saw logging companies move in. Of course, anytime you have that economic boost, you see new families moving into the area and starting new businesses, spending their money locally. It was devastating to see it happen, but at the same time, economically, it did help the community. But as you can see from the timber industry gross sales, there was a boom and a bust to that, which happened all in about 10 years. And so that they rode that wave of the boom and the economic vitality that came from this influx of folks into their community and the money that came from that, and then they saw it ride right on out of there. And so then coming back to talk to these folks, you know, that ship had already sailed, and economic times were back to being pretty tough. And that ties into, you know, support for forest industry, and that sort of faith that forest industry, or the idea that forest industry in various forms would be good for a community. And that varied, of course. As you can imagine, you know, Vail is not necessarily going to embrace a large-scale timber processing facility, right? And so the dark purple here is the large-scale timber processing. And the more amenity-oriented towns, those resort towns along the I-70 corridor in Colorado, well, they weren't too thrilled about massive logging trucks coming through town and, you know, a pulp mill or who knows what in their communities. But those other communities out in Grand County and Jackson County were that was fine to them. For a lot of people, over 40% in two of the communities and about over 70% in Walden, they thought that'd be terrific. That's just what their community needed. But other things were not quite so seen as something to avoid in these other communities. People were fine with some niche marketing or production of wood products, and that's really taken off. Some small-scale timber processing they thought was fine and actually really important, and they said that was something that they had really changed their tune on, and really saw that something should be done with these dead trees if it was at all possible. And a lot of embracing of the idea of biomass or biofuels power generation, particularly in Summit County, the community of Frisco. Its county buildings, just in the time we were studying, were converted over to biomass, being the energy being provided, and especially heating provided by biomass energy from the beetle-killed trees around them. So there were lots of, you know, it was a different kind of thing depending on different communities you were in. Well, changes on the Kenai Peninsula, as I mentioned, you know, you get a really different perspective. And what we found, especially in the interviews, those the bark beetles has as serious and as an emotional experience as it had been when I was there in 2002 and 3 and 4. By 2007 and 8, we went back in, and it was like, what bark beetles? Oh yeah, those beetles. Oh yeah, we've got some dead trees, but you know, there's no wringing of hands anymore. There's no new action or seeking information about what to do anymore. You know, it's gone as an important issue, and people are no longer interested. So the 4 years is a really pretty short time for something as serious as they really conveyed to me at one point, and to just simply move on and to see that, you know, that's just oh yeah, those gray trees, yeah, they're falling down. We're starting to see the little ones come up. It's getting better around here. So the time becomes a very important element. We're going back and talking to folks in Colorado now. Just in the last couple of months, we've started a restudy in Colorado. And I wouldn't say that they've turned around quite like they did on the Kenai. The Kenai beetle outbreak had really played out, and really not a lot of new activity, whereas in Colorado, it's still really going on. They talked about having a very active forest health industry. You know, in Breckenridge, there's a quote in here, the community's collective ethic toward tree removal has obviously softened quite a bit. You know, in Breckenridge, in 2003, 2004, 2005, you had to get a permit to cut down a tree. And if you didn't, you were fined, even if you cut a tree in your own yard, right? Well, that, you know, as all those trees were dead, they had to change a couple of local ordinances to deal with that situation. So that's what that quote's all about. And they said they still had the tourists coming in, so they didn't think it had affected their main economic engine as of yet, which they had been concerned of. And they say it still might come, but not yet. You know, people aren't quite sure how to handle change. It's an interesting experiment here in perception. So they're a little more thoughtful than they were. And then, of course, some people say, oh, the beetles have eaten through everything available. It's run its course. And this was actually by someone who had, in 2005, told me, if these beetles kill all the trees in this community, I won't live here anymore. But he's still there, and a lot of trees have been killed in Frisco. So there is a change in perspective that I think comes as the experience plays itself out. All right, well, just a couple of other vignettes, little stories about another realm that I think is very important and what we learned. And that is there are different ways of making sense of the changes in our forests. And we can use a scientific approach, right? But that's not going to necessarily resonate with everyone. Not everyone comes at experiences from a scientific perspective or with that lens. Moose Pass, Alaska here, the picture's on the right. Small, very small community, about 100, 120 folks perhaps. In 2001, they'd had some serious bark beetle activity along the lake here, just a few miles around the corner, maybe 5, 10 miles away. And so the Forest Service went out and they started a prescribed burn, and they were going to take out some of these beetle kill trees. And they started at 8 in the morning. And they didn't let anybody know. Well, the people in the community got wind that this was going on, and they got pretty uptight about this situation. And the Forest Service said, it's okay, we're going to monitor this all day. We'll be done by 5 o'clock. It'll be fine. Well, the local folks said, we're kind of, really getting uptight about this, because they knew that about 5 o'clock every day in the summer, the winds pick up from the south and would head right up across the lake, hit this mountain, and Moose Pass is right up around the corner. And they were really uptight about this. Well, about 5 o'clock, they thought they had this fire all put down, and sure enough, that fire picked right up. Right? But the locals during the day, they had been prepared for this, and they got bulldozers out, and they were prepared. They were really worried that this thing was going to come around and take their town out. But the Forest Service wouldn't let them get involved. Right? They wouldn't let them come onto the scene. And it burned. It didn't get to Moose Pass, but it came darn close. And so it's a little piece of the knowledge of the wind patterns and what's going on in this area that those Forest Service firefighters didn't have was a real disconnect, and it was a real source of a lot of friction that's still in that community today. And in the Kenai overall, fire risk communication was a sort of a sore spot there, because the scientists and the forest managers were, because there wasn't any local fire models there. They were using a fire model out of Alberta. Right? Well, let's see, I've got a pointer here. Alberta, as everybody knows, just to the north of Montana, is a fairly interior. It's pretty far from the coast, and its relative humidity can get pretty darn low. Right? These folks up on the Kenai, right up in here, are saying, you know, these folks are using a fire model from the interior state of Alberta. They have no idea of the relative humidities and the way our forests work. And you know, there may have been attributes or aspects of those fire models that were really quite appropriate for looking at the fire activity and beetle kill. But the locals felt that their understanding, or that their experiences with how fire works in their forests wasn't being taken into consideration in fire models. So there was a lot of argument about this. The other thing in Colorado, you know, there's this quote, "The more local, the greater the trust." And this really seemed to be true. Folks had a lot more trust and faith in the local district rangers, or especially the state foresters who actually stuck around in those communities a lot longer than they did for the bureaucrats back in Washington, D.C. The other thing is that the state foresters had a lot more clout and wore the white hats a lot more than the Forest Service in general did. And what's interesting in Colorado is when I was out there in 2005, 2006, a lot of the forest managers, especially the state folks, were saying, well, here's how the fire risk is going to work here. It's going to get real bad in the red needle phase of these trees, and that could be some tough fire times. But then that fire risk is going to drop way down, and we're not going to have a big fire risk. And then as those trees start to jackstraw and they start to fall down and we get ladder fuels in our forests, why that fire risk may come up again. But we're going to have a lag in here, and that might be 10 to 15 years where we're going to have a pretty low fire risk. And what's very interesting is we're doing interviews now. We've done about 25 interviews. And I think that they did the count, and over 16 people in those interviews, and these are community residents and folks, they mentioned something akin to this in their response into answering about fire risk. So that communication that I first heard from the state forester, who actually used to be the state forester in Alaska and used to be the state forester here in the state of Montana, Jeff Yankee, his story, and he would draw this out. We're actually hearing that again. And so that communication is happening, and those connections are being made and changing the concerns, something that didn't particularly happen in the case of Alaska. Okay. All right, we're moving our way along here. Well, what about this connection to climate change? You know, what's interesting here, we do have some people that said, what's going on here with these beetles? Well, it's climate change. So we have, let's go back. So we have this quote, what's caused the spruce bark beetle thing? In my opinion, I'm no scientist, but it's global warming. The temperature is coming up. Oh yes, when it gets to 67 degrees, these beetles come out and attack the trees. But you know, that was really a minority perspective, both in Colorado and in Alaska. Right? What we heard was there were plenty of people who would talk about the climate parameters. Yeah, when it gets warm, these beetles take flight, or it's been pretty dry here, or we really haven't had a cold winter enough to kill these beetles off. They got the climate connections on a local scale, but they were not making connections to a global scale, human-induced climate change scenario. And that was interesting. It wasn't particularly what I expected. They were happy to discuss natural cycles in climate change, but they didn't go to that other connection that some of the scientists and the forest managers in particular were leading with. And so the kind of take-home message that I got from this is that many of their objectives of what they'd like to see in their forests really were matching some of the forest management objectives for carbon sequestration. But climate change as a motivating theme was not going to resonate with these folks. And so another kind of language was going to be necessary to kind of work this out and come to grips with what was going on. And they had more comfortable talking about managing forests around the idea of maybe forest or community health, and not necessarily getting the climate change. They were happy to make changes, and their visions, again, were matching those of what scientists and forest managers thought of as a healthy forest, but not motivated necessarily by this climate change conversation. And what I think is going on here, and I think to a certain extent, we've got a bit of a scale mismatch in our conversations and our issues about climate change. We've got local experiences where climates are certainly changing, and they're dealing with things on a daily basis. And we have assessments at the regional scale. We have global scenarios, and we don't always communicate across these different scales. We're doing better at that, and we're downscaling our climate scenario modeling to the regional scale and getting more and more adept at grappling with what are these changes what might they mean at a very local scale of experience. But we still have some some scale jumping and some scale mismatch issues to deal with, and I was feeling that as I was in these communities. Well, these people weren't just kind of laying back and feeling the impacts. They were acting, all right? So what we have in Colorado, we had over 60 people in these communities were being involved in various, 60% were involved in at least one of these community-related actions, whether it was clearing trees in communities or going to a public meeting. And over 78% had taken at least one of these actions to remove dead trees or spray trees or use fire-resistant building materials. And so there was a sense of people really kind of getting involved and responding to these issues. In Alaska, you have to flip these back and forth. Communities over here and individuals here. And I don't have those aggregate percentages, but you can see here that the numbers of people taking individual actions were even higher. And probably that is because a lot of folks had trees on their property, even more than some of those Colorado residents. But folks were trying to do things, and they all wanted to know what more they could do and how they could get involved in this. And that was in general. But as you went from one community to the next, you'd see some real striking differences. And some communities were really cutting across all different perspectives in the community and working together and really trying to be innovative in how they dealt with this and trying to tap into whatever funds were available, whereas other communities really seemed to just not really be able to get their act together and really do mobilize responses. What we found was that sometimes some of the issues were, coordinating actions was not necessarily possible in all places. Not everybody, we can have maybe similar vulnerabilities and issues and risks, but not every community has the capacity to respond quickly and in a timely manner and work together amongst the different members of the community to respond. And so that was a real variation. Even communities 20 miles apart from each other, we'd see very different structures of how the community was mobilizing to deal with these bark beetle issues. A big issue both in Alaska and Colorado, and I'm sure it's an issue here in Montana, are the second homeowners or the absentee landowners that might be gone they might not come for a year or even 6-8 months, and all of a sudden they show up and all their trees are dead, and they don't know what to do about it, or maybe they're not even aware of it at all, and the neighbors are clearing trees and cutting, and they get slash piles, and they're really active, and they're pretty darn frustrated that there's this other plot right in between them where nothing's been done. And that was a source of a lot of friction. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, those that were adjacent to public land, despite their efforts, they really felt it was a drop in the bucket. And it wasn't just individuals taking action on their own lands or even within their neighborhoods. People were mobilizing to try to get things done within their broader view sheds, right? Make sure that there was defensible space, not just on their own property, but for their community as a whole. And so you got a lot of people at community meetings wondering what the Forest Service is doing, what is the community doing, and wanting to help and be part of that conversation. So what works? What actually mobilizes a healthy kind of community involvement in dealing and responding to these things? Well, every community's got its local opinion leaders, the people who have their finger on the pulse of the community, or at least a good part or portion of that community's members. And tapping into and knowing who those folks are and bringing them into the fold then has a diffusion effect out into the community. But some of those local opinion leaders are those people that have a particular axe to grind, and finding out who those people are and working with them too, but perhaps in a slightly different way. You've got to navigate those community dynamics, and for forest managers to be able to understand this going in is a very, very valuable thing. And local empowerment efforts. A lot of folks taking grassroots efforts like in Grant Creek to mobilize their actions together. But a lot of the actions that were taken were supported by federal funds and by federal programs for slash removal or just funds to mobilize community emergency response teams and to coordinate activities between fire departments and firefighting efforts from state and federal agencies. And these were very effective in some communities. Not all communities, but in some communities it seemed like a very local effort, but a lot of times it was driven and connected with those things coming from higher scales. And getting to that, what I found in Colorado was that mayors and municipal leaders, county commissioners, state forest managers, foresters, district rangers, and regional foresters. Very early on in this process, they really started to talk amongst each other and interact. And the Northwest Council of Governments in Colorado was very proactive early on. And this multi-scale and cross-regional cooperation, they didn't always agree on everything. And folks up in Walden and Granby thought that Vail was playing the heavy hand and they were getting all the resources. And so they didn't always agree, but they were communicating and talking. And they were able to really mobilize a lot of funds that found their way into Colorado communities to help deal with these bark beetles. In Alaska, not the case. You know, there were people, you know, state foresters who didn't even know the name of some of the state and private or the Chugach National Forest rangers. They didn't even know each other. They didn't have very many collaborative meetings. There were some efforts at this, but there was a lot of turnover of folks, and the municipal leaders never really got together. And I never ever saw the kind of regional collaboration and interaction in Alaska that I saw in Colorado. And as a result, there wasn't a lot of infiltration of funds and programming available. The programming that was available, they did get about $10 million early on in this to deal with, but it went to the borough level, and what did they do with it? They built a building, and they bought a bunch of computer equipment, and they mapped the bark beetle situation like crazy. And a lot of, you know, and a few programs to clear trees around power lines, but a lot of people felt that, you know, that money went into bricks and mortar and not into really helping them with their trees. So, you know, regional interaction and collaboration is also, you know, not alike across different places. So what's the final take-home message? Well, one size doesn't fit all. We have to understand that communities and regions and places are different from one another, and what the needs and vulnerabilities in one are different from the other, and the capacities to take action and respond to things like this also vary from one community to another. And the other thing that harkens back to some of these findings that we've come to over time. You know, wherever you come into a community and an experience like this, that's that point in time. And those folks may feel differently a year, 2 years, 4 years down the road. Now, does that mean that as forest managers that we go and say, oh, these people are really up in arms, but okay, if we just wait, they'll get over this, and we don't have to address it? That's not what I'm saying, because if you don't do anything, things might get worse instead of better over time. But there is a change. You know, these bark beetles have a dynamic in the forest, right? We saw that fire risk curve that the state forester drew. Well, I think communities have a dynamic to them too. And they go through their grieving process, but they come out of it, and there's a readjustment time. They adjust, especially if they can contribute and feel like they're doing something to help move this along, plant a couple trees perhaps, and work with their neighbors. You know, that makes them feel better, and they kind of start to readjust a little bit. Is it all rosy? No, there's some pretty unhappy things, and some people have been really strongly affected by this. But time is playing its role in how these communities respond and change. So with that, I just thank you for your time, and thank the Forest Service, both PNW and Region 2, and the Colorado State Forest Service, and my students, who I couldn't do this work without. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thanks. All right. Should we turn up the lights? Or? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was curious with your last slide, what works and what doesn't, about exactly how you define what works. Do you think that any of these activities you described, you define working as just engagement, or as actually accomplishing something?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think what works, I guess I'm sort of seeing it in the eyes of the general sort of community adjustment and community satisfaction with the experience. Not so much what works in terms of, as say, a defensible space kind of thing, or mitigating the bark beetles on the whole, or something like that. These things kind of have a life of their own. They're going to happen, right? There's very little you can do, I think, is the other lesson that everybody's learned from these things, to actually change the pace or what's going to happen with these trees and these beetles. Although there's a lot of people that will spray their trees and water their trees and think that they can make a difference on a tree-by-tree basis. But that's not really what I'm getting at. What makes the experience somehow palatable from a community's point of view. I guess, and from a forest manager's point of view too, so that they're not hung up in litigation and where everything, the bottom falls out. So I guess it's kind of a nebulous and a vague sort of term. It's sort of my idea of, I could point to the communities where whatever they were doing, and it was a collective of things, somehow it worked. They got through it. There was an adjustment. They were doing something, they felt okay. And communities where that just didn't happen. They didn't have the glue, and the conflict has increased. There's a sort of sense of resignation, and the sense of loss is a lot stronger for the lack of being able to do some of these things. Maybe not the answer you were looking for, but that's been my experience.
Of all the communities that you studied, how many had community wildfire protection plans, and did that make a difference in their attitudes and their work?
Yeah, and this has probably changed since I was in these communities. I didn't always go back and monitor. I think in Alaska, they were being done, and I think maybe 3 of them at the time when I was there, and I haven't actually followed up to see what's happened over time. A lot more of the Colorado communities either had or were working on community wildfire protection plans. I'm not sure if I was aware of one at the time in Breckenridge, but again, that may have changed, and we're going back to ask some of those questions. But the key is they were done in very different ways. In Steamboat Springs, we were at one of those meetings, and it was very inclusive. They had the maps out on the tables at the fire station, and it was really an open meeting and really advertised, and folks really came in, and it was community was represented there. In Vail, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan was written by one person, the town planner. And so they came in different forms. So the CWPP, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan in Vail, was not a process that mobilized community involvement, but it was very effective. Right? They still got a ton of money to do a lot of their tree clearing work based on that plan. Now, that's not the spirit in which the community wildfire protection plans were envisioned, but it was effective there. And some of the other ones that did have a lot of community support, I know they were really frustrated with the outcome. Some that had the community involvement were successful. So it was a really mixed bag.
Did that have anything to do with the wildland-urban interface map that they created? Did that have anything to do with it?
Well, and those mapping efforts were really different in different places too. And of course, remember that sort of local microgeography was different. So a community wildfire protection plan for Walden, right, where there's really no trees in or right around Walden, became more of a county-wide exercise. And so the trees are around the edges of Jackson County. And so those maps were very different. And they were mapping wildfire dangers to sort of special places, more so than for safety issues or maybe watershed issues. It was different. Whereas a community like Frisco, this was a community's wildfire protection plan was about saving lives and property. And so they took different forms. Yeah.
How has the Forest Service reacted to your findings?
Interesting question. Oh, sure. He asked, how has the Forest Service reacted to sort of my findings? The State Forest Service in Colorado has been great. They really, they were involved, they supported my work, they wanted the results, they've used the results, and they've been really terrific to work with. There's so much turnover within the Forest Service that the players I started with in both projects, by the time I finished even just the first wave, all the players were different. And so that was tough. The people who had called for and paid for the work weren't there at the end, and there wasn't anybody to really receive the findings and the reports and to incorporate them. So I was never really sure whether my work was being, I didn't even know if they got it. Or so I don't know within the Forest Service for the most part, although I have presented at forest health protection meetings, national meetings twice, to big audiences and had a lot of feedback. So from those working in forest health protection, they have called for and asked, and I get numerous requests to look at what is going on the social science side of these outbreaks, and there's interest in how do you make sense of this. So there's kind of a varied response. So I think a mixed response. Yep.
Did you find that when the Colorado State Forest Service used your findings that they had some beneficial results as compared to places that didn't?
I think that they I think it encouraged them to keep doing what they were doing. In fact, that's what they told me. It was kind of reinforcing. They wore the white hats. They had a lot of respect. The kinds of things they were doing to mobilize interaction. They had meetings that were 5-county meetings where everybody was invited, and they brought in a lot of players, and they encouraged dialogue. And we heard that those were well received, and we could see that this was people felt good about this, and satisfaction with their efforts was high. That was good for them to see, and then they kept doing more and more of that. So that's the one piece where I think it actually did some good. Beyond that, I'm not sure. Sometimes as academics, we do this stuff, we report on it, and sometimes we don't really know what the outcome of it is. Jill.
I noticed that the bar was pretty high and consistent on the response about biofuel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, or had any of the communities moved ahead to put in some kind of biomass fuel burners? Was there a lot of consensus around that as a good or bad thing?
In Colorado, there was quite a bit of activity, and again, in Frisco and Summit County, they were doing a lot of work with biofuels, and at the time, it was just kind of starting to ramp up, and people were generally happy. They liked the idea of this, and they liked the idea of utilizing this resource that they hated to see go to waste. And we're still kind of analyzing these recent interviews to see how they felt this has played out. There was a lot of concern that there would be maybe some smoke, or there'd be an increase in truck traffic as they were getting these trees from here to there. But in some of just the coarser findings from those follow-up surveys, it's certainly not coming out loud and clear as there's been any problems. So it sounds like it's gone okay, but I think we need to do some more work on that and find out. I don't have a full answer to that. There was a lot of interest in biofuels in Alaska, but I'm not necessarily aware that there have been any real systematic efforts to put it in place. The infrastructure for something like that is costly, and there were fewer resources in Alaska than there were in Colorado for things like that.
Do you think that community wealth played a role in community involvement at all, like in community versus like Vail versus Walden?
Yeah, she asked if community wealth like Vail versus Walden played a role in these kinds of responses, and absolutely the answer has to be yes. I mean, not just wealth, but power, right? That ability to really put pressure on folks and to make things happen, yes. But I think that there were also examples that defied that. There were some cases in some neighborhoods, for example, where they were not the wealthiest neighborhoods, and they didn't have the resources. But somebody had a truck, and a couple guys would get their chainsaws out, and somebody'd make a call to somebody that was willing to come in and truck out the slash, and they would put those resources, their collective resources together, and make something happen at a community scale that wasn't driven at all by wealth. And there were some communities, very wealthy subdivisions around Silverthorne, or where you're talking $1 million homes, and nothing was happening, and they couldn't really seem to pull anything together. They were waiting for someone else to come in and take care of the problem, and they'd be willing to pay for it, but folks were busy, and they may have gotten around to it eventually. But so that's where it kind of broke down. But in terms of large-scale responses and influencing, especially Forest Service efforts on larger tracts of land and mobilizing timber harvesting contracts and the like, those wealthier communities were pretty successful. Yeah.
Sort of a similar question. I was wondering if you noticed any connection between people's political affiliation and their sort of willingness to accept this as a climate change problem, as a bigger problem.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? He asked if political persuasion influenced this perception of whether or not climate change was playing a role with these bark beetles or not. I'd be lying if I said no. So at a core scale, yeah, and I have the data. We have their political persuasion, those who were willing to fill in the bubble. Many chose to ignore that question, which is common. But not exclusively, not across the board, particularly in Alaska, which felt like it had, yet again, another sort of political persuasion than anything we find in the lower 48. And so there were the Democrats, there were the Republicans, and then there were the Alaskans who'd been there for 50, 60, 70 years. And they didn't really fit in that category, and they didn't want to be told by anyone anything about what was happening, that they knew what was happening in their place, and they could give a rip. And I'm exaggerating, okay? Yeah, I mean, it definitely, I mean, I think the climate change debate has come down to, in a large respect, sort of, political lines. There's no doubt about it. But when you get into these places and you're talking about experiences, these people were happy to talk about climate changes. They were living climate. You want to know climate change, they'd say, you come and hang out here for 30 years, you'll see climate change. Well, I can show you climate change. But Democrats, Republicans, a lot of times it was really hard to get them to actually identify that way. They just, they're living their lives, and they see this conversation, this debate, and going on at another scale in another place. And it wasn't something they felt that connected to. That being said, as we went back into these communities 4 years later, we did hear more people engaging in this conversation. I mean, how can you not? There's the science is largely there, and the media is certainly playing a role here. But there was a reluctance to sort of engage in it. Sometimes people just don't want to engage in something as politically hot button as climate change, but they have their own local experience. But the answer is yes, but with some modifications. All right, what do we have?
Sort of a follow-up to that, did you see a difference between very rural area and very isolated area in Alaska to Colorado that has a lot more affluent and more connected, maybe?
Yeah, it didn't break down like that. In Alaska, you've got Homer, which is a very green, liberal community, and we had great variation within that community even. So even within the Kenai Peninsula and even within the communities, there were variations on whether this was a natural process or whether this bark beetle thing was the fault of the Forest Service for not letting us cut as many trees as we needed to cut. Lots of different perspectives. So can't sweep with those broad brushes. Colorado too. Yes, you get big changes between the sort of those ski resort communities and those old ranching towns, and those differences are pretty obvious, right? But within them, there were subtle differences as well. There's a coarse scale thing that falls out like that, but variations within this, these communities are heterogeneous, and it's, all the people in this room are wildly different from one another on many levels. And then on other scales, you could probably lump us all in one category. So it depends on how you slice and dice people. Thank you.
How did you ultimately ask the question of your interviewees about the connection between climate change and forest change due to insects?
She asked, how did I ask the questions about the connections between climate change and forest disturbance? I made a decision early on in this study that I was not going to ask I wasn't going to bring up climate change. I was going to wait and see if they brought it up to me. So I asked, what do you think's behind this? So how do you think this thing has happened? What led to this bark beetle outbreak? An open question. I didn't want to lead them into saying yes or no on climate change. And so I waited, and the analysis was on, did it emerge without being asked in the earlier study? In Colorado, we started with that approach, and then then we kind of had a philosophy change, and then we kind of started asking the question more directly. So we've been a bit inconsistent about that, and the students sometimes can't help. They want to know, do you think this is climate change? So they'd ask, and then we did have problems with, that would contaminate the data, and that was a big issue. So we haven't always been very consistent with that question. But when I started, I didn't lead with it. And maybe that's why I didn't hear it. Maybe if I'd asked it, I'd have a different opinion, a sense about this. But I wanted to see what sort of organically came from people. How are we for time? Any other questions? Yes?
Is there some sort of, maybe like as a result of this, you can pour like a database that like these community leaders and organizers could utilize to maybe figure out what works where, and maybe have some plans and
stuff like that, maybe access to funding if they need it or something like that?
Yeah, he asked if there's anything we could do as a result of this this research to put together a database that with plans and data and kind of compile all this into something, a resource that can be utilized. And yeah, in my next lifetime, I would be glad to, but yes, we can. And I've got the reports and they're available on the websites, and I'm publishing things in the journals. And so some of that stuff's out there. Something like that would take some funding and some support to put it together, and I'm not sure anyone's really calling for it, to be honest. As academics, that's a disconnect sometimes we have. We like to think that the work we do is really important, and it's of course going to be used, and decisions will be made on the basis of these findings that we make. I'm not quite that naive. I think we do what we do when we put it out there. As a person from a land grant institution, I take my role seriously as a land grant scientist, and we need to do our work in a way that makes sense and it does support decisions and really makes changes viable, and it gives a voice. I guess for me that's most important, is getting these voices of the people in these places at the table. But I'm uncomfortable with getting into the realm of sort of advocacy and then advocating on their behalf. There's a fine line in there somewhere, and I'm still navigating where that is. Yeah, it'd be great to put something like that together. And to a certain extent there's colleagues I have in Canada, been working on the human dimensions of bark beetles in British Columbia and Alberta, and in Europe, in Germany, and we've published together a synthesis of what are we hearing, what are we finding in these places, and so we have published that, and that's available in the scholarly literature. Yeah, we should do a lot more to build something like that. And maybe I'll take that idea home with me and see if I can't play it for some funding, see what happens.
My question would be, what was the attitude of the people who did the processing, the loggers or all the logs that went through the mill, as regards to climate change? Did they accept that factor because they're in the business of logging that stuff? They have a different perspective, like a lot of ranchers have in Montana. Certain people in the logging community have a different attitude. People in Missoula, Montana, you know where I'm getting at?
Yeah, I know what you're getting at. The question is, are the people who are in the timber harvesting business, the loggers and those folks running the mills and so forth, what were their attitudes about climate change? And did they sort of fit with the kind of extractive industry kinds of folks, or more, in contrast to, say, your stereotypical sort of Missoula kind of community, or Homer, Alaska, or whatever. And yeah, as you would expect, they weren't too eager to jump on the climate change bandwagon. However, you would hear a couple folks saying, well, this bark beetle thing's been pretty good for us. It's about time we got back and cut some of these trees. Too bad they happen to be dead, but this isn't so bad. And if this is what climate change is going to bring, then bring it on. Let it kill more trees. We'll go cut them down. So, you'd get the kind of sort of a flippant response more is when climate change would enter the conversation. It was just something that, this is what they do. They're making a living, doing something that they thought had a real purpose. It gave them not only jobs, but kind of, it reinforced their identity as loggers and as people that were trying to utilize a forest resource. And what was very interesting in some communities is, in, say, Vail, Breckenridge, or those kind of communities where loggers would not necessarily have been the best friend of some of those folks in those community beforehand. A lot of those folks were pretty happy that there were loggers willing to come in and take care of those trees. So a real kind of a sea change in the relationships between different elements of communities that had been pretty polarized, especially through the 70s and 80s in Colorado, as the kids that have been in the case in Montana too. Kind of coming together and having sort of a same vision, or sharing the experience in a more of a synergistic way. So. Ron?
What are the reactions of the foreign governments like in Germany and France as compared to the United States?
He asks, what are the different, I'm not repeating every question, I'm sorry, but I'll repeat this one. The difference in the government response and the policies of say, European countries versus the United States. I don't know all the nuts and bolts of this, but one thing that's very interesting in Germany, there was a real sea change in their national parks management in Germany, where they really made a change in the 1990s to say they were going to manage these forests for natural flux, natural change. And so if this was a natural process, it was going to run its course. And they weren't going to manage this. They weren't going to harvest trees. You know, it was going to let nature run its course, sort of philosophy. And that was institutional. I mean, that became policy, especially at least for protected areas. And of course, that was met in some ways by the public. Were supportive of that. That's how the policy was put into place, because people wanted to see those areas being managing for natural fluxes and natural changes. But by the proximate communities, you can imagine the outrage of that, because they really were unhappy. They thought these things could and should be managed. And so there's still a lot of tension there. You know, I still think that we're working out in this country. I don't know that we have necessarily settled on what our philosophy or our approach is to kind of forest changes. We've seen a sea change in how we deal with fire over the last couple decades, but I still don't think we've settled on something. I think we're still working that out. It seems to changes with administrations, it changes with experience. And in terms of bark beetle things, you know, we started managing bark beetles as a fire issue. And then we had the science come in and say, you know, the fire risk in bark beetles may not actually be as high as we think it is. The historical record suggests that, you know, it may not be as big of a fire hazard. And we have this cycle or this dynamic here. And then we started to manage bark beetles for different ways. And we started to manage them for water resource issues. And we started to kind of appreciate that this was a natural turnover in these forests, and we start to manage for the next forest. And it depends on who you talk to. I don't think we have settled on a common policy or philosophy in this country as relates to forest change. I just don't see it yet. Everybody ready to go on with their evening? Well, I appreciate you spending time with you this evening. Thank you very much.